Good afternoon. We're going to give everybody just another couple seconds to join here today, but I'd like to welcome everybody to the monthly Conexxus webinar series. Today we are talking about Chargebacks 101, the basics, and we're very pleased to have Caleb Burke from Sitka Petroleum with us today. A couple of our agenda today is housekeeping items. I'll go over a few of those, talk a little bit about Caleb and his experience. I'll talk about Conexxus and what makes Conexxus so great, and then we'll go through the presentation, and then we'll end with a question and answer session. Can everybody hear me okay? I just want to make sure if you cannot or if you're having difficulties, we've been having some technical difficulties this morning, so please use your question panel if you have any questions or are experiencing any technical difficulties. So thank you. So moving on, I just wanted to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. You can find the recording under YouTube under the Conexxus Online subscription, or you can go to Conexxus.org under resources, and there's a whole webinar section. And folks, we've had some great webinars here, so please feel free to look at some of those. If you upon the conclusion of the webinar, about an hour later, you will receive a survey link via email. And if you complete, it's just a very short survey, 3 or 4 questions tops. If you complete the survey, then you will receive a link to the deck. And we do ask, everybody's on mute today, and so we do ask that you ask questions using the GoToWebinar panel. There's a question section. You can just click on that and put in your questions, and then please no specific vendor questions. If you do have any comments later, please go to Connexxus.org. So moving on, our host today from Conexxus is Allie Russell. And I'm your moderator, Cara Gunderson. I chair the Data Security Standards Committee. I'm a volunteer for Conexxus. By day, I'm the point of sale manager at Sitka Petroleum. And in the room with me, I'm very pleased to have one of my own from Sitco here is Caleb Burke. He is our payment card operations manager. A little bit about Conexxus, in that we're an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. As I mentioned earlier, we are comprised mostly of volunteers. There's very few staff folks, and those volunteers come from all the stakeholders within the industry. They set standards for data exchange, security, mobile commerce. Conexxus also is great about providing vision, identifying emerging technology and trends, and definitely is an advocate for our industry. As I mentioned earlier, you can find all of our previous webinars on either the Conexxus.org website or on YouTube if you search for Conexxus. We've had some really, really great webinars, and we obviously are gleaning a lot of our own membership, and of course Caleb is a volunteer just like I am, and is freely giving his time today, and we're capitalizing on that expertise. And so as you can see also, we have some great webinars coming up in 2019 as well. I'd like to point out that the Conexxus annual conference is in Nashville this year at the end of April, beginning of May, and we'd like to thank our 2018 annual conference diamond sponsors. Now let's move into the presentation. Caleb Burke, as I mentioned, is the operations manager here at Sitka Petroleum with me, and he's responsible for chargebacks, fraud, and fraud mitigation. He has 7 years of experience in petroleum payment cards. He also has experience from the acquire processor level as well, and we're extremely happy to have him on our team. He definitely is an expert in this field. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caleb.
Thank you, Cara, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join me today. Today we're going to go through just the very basics of a chargeback, why they occur, and what we can do as merchants to either prevent them or to respond to them. For some of you, this is going to be very daily stuff that you do every day, but I hope that everyone is able to walk away at least learning one small thing. So what exactly is a chargeback? The technical definition is a debit to a depositor's account that offsets a previous credit. So in other words, it's basically a forced return for a previous sale. The difference here is that the customer or the cardholder is asking their bank to return the funds rather than working directly with the merchant. And in most chargeback scenarios, the cardholder keeps both the funds and the goods and services. Chargebacks were originally created as a form of consumer protection during the early adoption of credit card use. People were afraid that their card was going to get lost or stolen, and they didn't want to have a huge bill run up. So in 1974, they enacted the Fair Credit and Billing Act, which gave us chargebacks as we know it. While the payments industry has evolved, the chargebacks have largely stayed the same, which is kind of why we're in the predicament we're in today as merchants. So the chargeback process is pretty drawn out, and timelines and rights vary by card brands, but in its simplest form, it's initiated by the cardholder. They send a request to their bank disputing the transaction. The bank then reviews it, assigns it a code, and passes it on to the merchant's acquirer. In theory, the acquirer should be checking the dispute request, making sure that it's valid, that it falls within the issuer's guidelines and their rights, and then they would pass that on to the merchant. When it gets to us as the merchant, that's when we have the ability to either accept it and be debited for the chargeback, or to reject it and what we call represent the transaction. When we do that, we are putting additional documentation forth that says, no, we believe this is a valid charge, and here's why. Should the dispute remain unsolved after this process, the issuer can then move it into a second round of dispute or into arbitration. Arbitration is more of a legal process, and that has a very high cost to us as merchants. So we want to make sure that if we are representing a sale, that we represent it correctly the first time. So why do chargebacks occur? Well, according to Visa and MasterCard, there are four main categories. Fraud, which makes up about 80% of chargebacks. Authorization issues and customer disputes, each of those are about 7.5% of chargebacks. And then processing errors are about 5%. Here we have just kind of the most common chargeback reason codes. We see these every day. There shouldn't be anything new on there. Everything on here should look very familiar. If you'll notice, they kind of fall into the separate categories: fraud, EMV, fraud, lost, and stolen, authorization, processing errors, and customer disputes. So now let's take a look into each of the categories a little bit more in depth. Fraud. We're all familiar with fraud. It's one of our biggest, if not the biggest hurdle that we face every day. Fraud is the most common reason for all chargebacks, making up more than 80% of all issuer received chargebacks. In the payments industry overall, it's increased 33% since 2017. The biggest increase that we've seen is in AFD fraud. With the delay of EMV for the AFDs, they are a prime target for people to come use counterfeit cards. There's not an attendant, there's no one they have to be involved with. They can insert their fake plastic, pump their gas, and be on their way in less than 5 minutes. So it's a super easy target for them. And one thing that really struck out to me is 80% of fraud is what issuers would consider friendly fraud. And what do we mean by friendly fraud? Friendly fraud, the customer, when they come in to make that purchase, either they have malicious intent in knowing that, hey, I'm going to buy this GPS unit and then charge it back so I don't have to pay for it. They have buyer's remorse. Let's say that they came into your service bay, bought a new set of tires, and then something happened, they weren't going to be able to pay for them, so they dispute the transaction. Or they didn't qualify for a refund. If you're a merchant that doesn't have a lengthy refund process, and the customer tries to come back after your refund period is over, they still feel like they should get their money back, they can dispute the transaction with the bank. So those are all types of friendly fraud. Fraud migrates to non-EMV businesses. So just something to keep in mind. While we're waiting on EMV to limit your fraud, use dip verification at your dispensers. On the inside, you can prompt for the last 4 of the card. If it's a counterfeit card, the chances that the last 4 on the front that match the track data are very, very low. So that's a good way to get a card to decline. And limit your high fraud merchandise. Don't sell gift cards on credit cards. Limit the cartons of cigarettes. Anything that could be a potentially high fraud item while you're waiting on EMV. Just take extra caution when accepting a payment card as your form of payment. If you're EMV compliant, limit your fallback, especially out at the AFD as we roll that out. Refer those folks inside. Prompt for PIN when available. Make sure that your PIN bypass settings are correct, and complete all your scheduled POS updates. EMV is new, especially to us in petroleum. We're fixing things as we find them, so make sure that any update that's rolled out, that you're on top of that and you're downloading that and implementing that quickly.
Now you mentioned fallback, and so there's fallback, what we historically know, and then there's EMV fallback. So maybe can you explain the difference real quick?
Right, so historically fallback has been if you were offline and you were unable to get an authorization.
Or like stand-in mode.
Stand-in mode.
The
terminal would go ahead and approve it and then send it online when it reconnected. EMV fallback is a little bit different. What that refers to is when you insert the chip, if the chip cannot be read, it will fall back to mag stripe.
Okay.
When that happens, the mag stripe rules and liability then take effect. So we need to be extra cautious if we, as an industry, allow fallback to know that, I can manipulate the chip on my own to where it won't read to force the terminal to go to fallback, and then I'm liable. So even though I've done what I'm supposed to do as an EMV compliant merchant, I can still be liable because of one setting.
So earlier you said that you recommend, not allowing EMV fallback at the dispenser, maybe saying, please see attendant, so that the attendant can at least verify.
Right. And typically, if it is someone who has a counterfeit card, they know it's counterfeit. If they get that see attendant message, they're not going inside.
Yeah.
They're going to hit the next place.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. And and AFD, by the way, automated fuel dispenser. Yeah. Okay.
The next category that we're going to look at is authorization. This basically refers to either not receiving an online authorization or a stand-in authorization. A few things here: never make up an approval code. If you get a call for voice authorization message, really call the number, because that is something that the card brands keep track of. Don't just enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's an automatic red flag. Never enter a code that a customer provides you. Let's say somebody comes in to buy a couple cartons of cigarettes and they say, hey, my card's gonna ask you for an approval number. This is what my bank told me to give you. That's an automatic red flag. Don't do it. If the card cannot be electronically read, you have the ability as a merchant, you have the right as a merchant to ask for an alternate form of payment. Keep a record of all of your sales transactions. And one thing that we started doing at Citgo, if you receive a no authorization chargeback, and when you're going through your transaction data and you're looking at it, and you feel certain that that was online approved from the issuer, you can actually work with your acquirer or your processor or even your brand to get the network log to show where that transaction flowed through the network to the issuer, was approved, and back. We've had some success using those in representation. Processing errors. I guess my biggest advice is make friends with your POS product managers. What they do directly impacts your chargeback team. How it's coded, how it's implemented, that is going to directly impact your chargeback liability. Review your beta sites for abnormal chargebacks. Go over those with your POS managers. Make sure that all your kinks are worked out before you roll out to a grander scale. Your point of sale is going to be key in chargeback prevention. That's how your data flows through. So if data, is flowing through from the get-go incorrect, it's just going to be a mess. Again, complete your software updates in a timely manner. Make sure your taxes are calculated for products that aren't fuel. Make sure you've got the right tax in there. Make sure you've got the right product codes, especially for your fleet chargeback. Check the date and time on your point of sale. I know a lot of us have it to where it's auto-synced. For those of you that don't, once a day when you're running your end of day, just make sure that the date and time that's spitting out on your report is correct. That's the easiest way to avoid a lot of chargebacks. And train your staff on proper sales procedures. Make sure they're ringing up items correctly. Make sure they're applying coupons correctly. Make sure they're applying discounts, taxes, any type of warranty. Just make sure they're following proper sales procedures.
So if you're branded or you have a major oil brand, then you could contact your brand and know that your brand has those POS product managers that you talked about.
Yes.
Now, if you're unbranded and you're a smaller shop, is it best to maybe go talk to your payment processor and have them work with their product managers as
I
well?
would. Most payment processors have product managers that can kind of step in, and they don't mind helping out, or they can at least put you in contact with someone, maybe at your Verifone, Scabarco, whomever, that can work with you directly.
Okay, great, thanks.
Customer disputes, these get a little tricky and are probably the most frustrating for merchants. Customer can dispute a transaction for a multitude of reasons. Was the good damaged or defective? Was it not as described? They didn't receive it, or they didn't recognize your name. Not recognizing the name is probably one that we've seen take off here lately. Make sure that the signage at your business is what's reflected on the cardholder statement. If your sign says Bob's Gas Station, but on the customer's description it says Fueling 123, they're going to be confused. If you don't know what's coming on your customer statements, you can ask your brand if you're branded. If you're unbranded, you can ask your acquirer or your processor, and they can give you the outline of what is on the statement. If you have a garage or a service bay, make sure that when you complete work, you're getting signed work orders, that you're having the customer attest to that the work was done as requested, and that they verified the work. Just a quick few things on receipt best practices. Handing a receipt to your customer is good protection against chargebacks. And on those receipts, you should include your business name and address. Again, you want to make sure that the name that's on there is the most recognizable and what's going to show up on their descriptor. Your itemize each charge, including any taxes, fees, or warranties. Include the last four of the card number they use, the approval code. If your terminal is EMV capable, I would recommend putting the EMV data on there. This will help you when you go to dispute a transaction that was charged back for EMV reasons. It's easy to highlight that and say, nope, look here, I got my chip, here's my AID number, and that was approved. Customer name and signature if applicable, and we'll go into that a little bit later, and the transaction date and time. We also recommend that on the receipt, you disclose any return or cancellation policy you have. That kind of sets the expectation for the customer as well as the card issuer as to what your refund policy is and why the customer did not qualify. General dispute guidelines. Remember, the burden of proof lies with us as the merchant. So that means we impact the result. The first and foremost thing we need is to have a roadmap for how to handle chargebacks. Does it make sense to respond to all chargebacks? There is a cost of representment. So we need to look at, is it a value worth it? Is it a small transaction? Is it a case that historically I've had success with? Do I have the proper documentation? Can I provide the proper documentation to win this case? Is it basically worth my time? Review chargebacks to confirm they're valid. Issuers are notorious for shifting things through to the merchant. So double check those, make sure they're valid. When verifying they're valid, first look at your reason code, take that reason code, and then go through your transaction details. Make sure that those two line up. If it was charged back for non-EMV, check your terminal's capabilities. If it was charged back for non-PIN, but you know that that terminal is EMV capable, check your PIN bypass settings. Maybe there's something in there that's being sent wrong that you need to correct that could prevent these types of going forward. Respond to all requests in a timely manner. Even if you're going to accept the chargeback, responding and accepting that moves the chargeback process along and kind of keeps you in good graces with the card brand. Provide any documentation during the initial representment. The more information you provide the first time, the greater chance that dispute is going to be settled in the initial representment and prevents it from moving forward to any other cycles or arbitration and will save you money.
So you had just mentioned a little bit ago about getting signed work orders, especially like for the service base. So if you had a chargeback, would you include the receipt plus
Absolutely,
the signed?
absolutely. A receipt, the signed work order, and a letter of rebuttal, which we'll go into on the next slide. So disputing a chargeback or representment, however you want to call it, send in everything you can get. Anything you can get your hands on that pertains to that transaction, send it in. There's no such thing as too many documents. Receipts, statement of work, signed work order, communications that you've had with the customer. Issuers are getting really big on trying to get the customer to resolve it with the merchant without them being involved. So if you had a conversation with the customer, if you've had an email chain with the customer in which you tried to rectify or you've offered an alternative, include that. That shows that you're willing to work with the customer, that you've provided a solution, and that will go a long way. If you're being charged back because of a processing error, provide additional sales data or correcting sales data. A lot of times fleet will charge back for invalid product code. You can submit the correct product code, they'll reprocess the transaction, and it's a chargeback win. Subdrafts for your AFD or debit transactions that you may not have a receipt. And we always like to include a rebuttal letter. It doesn't have to be a 10-page letter, just a very quick summary of, we followed these guidelines, we feel this is an invalid chargeback because.
Okay. That's good.
We touched a little bit on the previous slide about subdrafts. So that really applies to our automated fuel AFD chargebacks. Check with your brand, or if you're unbranded, your acquirer, to see if they have a specific format or template for you to use. The subdrafts are easily created in Microsoft Word or Excel, products like that. Just basic information, your terminal ID, the location name and address, the date and time of the transaction, the card, approval number, and then the product information. What did they purchase? How much was it per gallon? How much did they purchase? And the total price. And make sure that you're putting a disclaimer on there that information was received from a customer activated terminal and no signed receipt is available. Chargebacks, talking about chargebacks wouldn't be complete without talking about the excessive chargeback program. We're all familiar with this. We are all pained by this. The most important thing here is that to remember, hitting the excessive chargeback list can and will shift your AFD EMV liability to you, the merchant, prior to the October 2020 deadline.
So say that again. So basically, if you reach these,
if you hit these lists and you do not remediate out as outlined by the card brands, you lose EMV indemnification. So that means that any chargeback from your outside fuel dispensers will be passed to you, the merchant.
So the 3-year extension that they gave us
is null and void.
Null and void if you reach this.
Yes.
Okay.
So be proactive, work with your brand, work with your acquirer. I know that outside counterfeit is super tricky. We don't have people out there inspecting the cards. We're basically trusting the customers. So work with your brand, work with your processor or acquirer to see what host settings they have available. Velocity is a good one. AVS obviously is a good one. If you participate in Visa VTA, that's a good one. Setting these changes on the host is what's going to keep you off of these naughty lists. So recently, we've had a few changes to the chargeback environment. The biggest was the Visa Claims Resolution, which went live in April 2018. It was designed to simplify and reduce chargebacks. Speaking from personal experience only, I do not see a reduction in chargebacks. If anything, slight increase, and that could again be because fraud is moving to the AFDs. They introduced what they call allocation versus collaboration. Basically, they categorize everything into the 4 categories we've been discussing, and allocation is where liability is automatically shifted to us as the merchant. So those are kind of what they're considering automatic chargebacks. We can represent those and we can provide documentation, but those are much harder to win. The collaboration is the customer disputes and the processing errors. They chose this name because they really want us to work with them and the cardholder to correct the issue so that the sale could be processed. These are the ones that we always need to require documentation from and submit. They were also designed to prevent invalid issuer chargebacks. Visa is supposed to be using the system to scan the chargebacks they receive from their issuers and stopping invalid ones. We have seen a small improvement with that as we get further away from the implementation. At the beginning, it was almost business as usual, but as we get further and further away from the April date, it's getting better. This also removes what they call the REFCO, or request for copy process. What that means is that Visa is no longer going to ask you to provide a ticket for a chargeback they're going to move it straight to a chargeback. So you can still provide a ticket, but that chargeback has going to already have been settled to you, and if you win, then you're basically reimbursed. So they've cut out the step, gone straight to the chargeback. You still have the same representment right. It's just that the money is going to be deducted up front, and it's on you to prove it to get your money back. It also shortens the response time to 30 days. That is the 30 days is the absolute latest. I believe they start penalties after 20 days. And they've made it now to where you have to respond to everything. Even if you're going to accept the chargeback, you have to respond within 20 days or you start getting penalties. So work with your brand, work with your acquirer. There are a lot of reasons that can be automated to accept so that you aren't even getting close to that 20 days. You get it. You kind of know the deal that you're not going to win or that it's not worth it. Auto accept those and prevent yourself from unnecessary fines.
Okay. We had just somebody ask if you could explain the difference between allocation versus collaboration one more time, please.
Sure. Allocation, those are your fraud and EMV descriptors, and that is where liability is automatically shifted to the merchant. So they're allocating that liability to us. Those are automatic and hard to win with representment. Collaboration, those would be your customer disputes and processing error disputes. Those are where they want us to work with them to correct the sale, to submit documentation so that the sale can be adjusted and settled outside of the chargeback process.
Okay, thank you.
So MasterCard has decided they're going to roll out something similar. We got kind of a little preview. It was a little rough around the edges, but we have some great people from the petroleum industry that are helping them with that. The estimated go live on this is April of 2019. Their main goal is to align their reason codes and to shorten the dispute cycle. So both Visa and MasterCard are trying to make a more positive customer experience. In the past, customers have disputed a transaction and it could take up to 120 days, which is 4 months to complete the dispute and get the funds back. What they're really trying to do is make it easier for their cardholders to get a dispute in, get it settled right away, and open that line of credit back up.
Can we just go back? We had another question here. So were you talking about the time frame and the response time frame? So if you're branded, where does that dealer fall into the equation and time frame?
So it kind of shortens it down the road, right? So you have 30 days to respond to Visa via your acquirer.
So that's the merchant of record. So your oil brand is typically the merchant of record, right?
So the 30 days is the absolute latest. They recommend 20. So if you've got to respond to them in 20 days, your brand may require you respond to them like we do in 10 days.
Yeah.
So it shortens everybody.
So then we reach out to our marketer or branded wholesaler who then reaches out to their dealer.
Right.
So in that time frame, it may be down to like 2 or 3 days just because of the time frame that everybody has to take internally to process.
Right. Okay. We try to give folks 10 days because that's almost 2 weeks. We feel like the manager has been there, is able to get into the point of sale to retrieve the information.
But it just depends.
It depends on your brand. It depends on your acquirer. Some acquirers, I believe, are requiring that you submit to them in the 20 days. They're not even giving you the 30. So if you have any questions about the timeline, check out to your brand, check out to your acquirer if you're unbranded, and just make sure that you're within their guidelines. MasterCard, they have not made any statement or commitment regarding their timeline. So right now they're telling us they're not going to change, but don't take that to the bank.
Yeah, because typically what one does, the other soon follows at some point.
So be extra vigilant when the April or the spring compliance release comes out. There will be more details about the MasterCard Claims Manager. Just double check there. And again, work with your brand or your acquirer to make sure that the time that you're used to operating in still fits within these timelines.
Okay, thank you.
Another thing that kind of relates to the chargeback world, the new no signature rules. According to every card brand that I have talked to, signature has no bearing on a merchant's representment rights. So whether your receipt is signed or unsigned does not matter when disputing a chargeback. So right now, as it stands, Visa, if you are EMV capable, you do not have to prompt for signature. MasterCard, Amex, and Discover are no signature regardless of if you're EMV capable. But one thing to remember, as the merchant, you have the right to continue asking for signatures. So check with your brand, check with your acquirer to see if they have any signature requirements. Just because Visa says it's okay doesn't mean it's okay with the process that you are using.
So on Visa, where it says no signatures required on transactions as long as you are accepting EMV cards, right? So what happens if you can accept EMV cards inside but not outside?
In that case, I mean, outside isn't prompted for signature anyway, so you would go by your EMV capable, your inside does not have to have a signature.
Okay, thank you.
So kind of just to summarize what we went over today, I know it was a lot and it's very general, and I would be happy to speak with anyone who wants to drill down into it. But we have 4 categories of chargebacks: fraud, authorization issues, processing errors, and customer disputes. When looking at your chargebacks and how you're going to handle them, develop a roadmap. What is the cost of working it? Can you reasonably expect to win the case? What has your success rate been? Is it worth it? Any request that you get, whether it's from your brand, whether it's from your acquirer, respond to that in a timely manner. Sending the information in quickly is the easiest way to win a chargeback. Visa and MasterCard will continue to streamline their processes for customer experience. So that kind of means that us as the merchants are on the back end and we kind of get the brunt of it. So just be prepared for additional changes. And probably the one that I cannot stress enough to my dealers and my locations are: be prepared for increased chargebacks if EMV is not implemented by the 2020 deadline for outside.
So how much of it, I mean, let's just hypothetically say, what if you had a crystal ball today and you said, if somebody's going to not do outdoor EMV, where do you think that realistically is going to be? I mean, is it going to be twice as much or
3 to 4 times as much? As we mentioned earlier, fraud migrates to non-EMV merchants. So the more folks who implement EMV kind of shrinks the pool of where these criminals can go to use the counterfeit cards. So let's say there are 4 gas stations on your corner. The other 3 have upgraded to EMV. You haven't. You're going to get hit.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I guess the scariest thing today is we aren't prepared because these aren't chargebacks that we see, right?
Right.
These are what the issuers are absorbing currently. So unless you go out and you ask for reports, you're kind of walking blindly. You have no idea what it is. So in my opinion, you can either make the investment to upgrade now and take advantage of special programs from your brands, from the vendors, depreciate that over time and use that strategy, or you can have your settlement automatically shortened with $50,000 worth of chargebacks a month.
And at that point, you just go, if it's $50,000 over even 3 months period of time, that's going to be $200,000 in a year. And so if you don't upgrade by October 1st of 2020 for your dispensers, you're going to pay $200,000 in chargebacks plus your upgrades.
Right. And I strongly recommend for anybody who's concerned or who's on the fence about, well, do I even need to upgrade? Let's say I'm in rural Kentucky, I have no fraud, do I need to upgrade? Reach out to your brand, reach out to your processor. They have reports that can show you how much the card issuers have absorbed for your location year to date. Take that number and multiply it by 3 because that's what you're going to get.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, so the way that I like to summarize fraud is basically like in 2 buckets. You've got lost and stolen, which we as merchants have been absorbing for years. And then there's counterfeit, when you still have your card in your wallet, but somebody has been able to get the card number and has made their own card. So like, we are here in Houston, but somebody has my card using it at the grocery store in Ohio.
Right.
That's obviously a counterfeit card. So that counterfeit liability chargebacks is what we've not been seeing for chargebacks, and that's what we.
And that's the bulk of it. I mean, that is the bulk of it. And then another thing to remember when talking about EMV is just, is it going to be worth it? Just business decisions.
Yeah.
Just keep that in mind. Can you afford as a business to not upgrade and then be unexpectedly hit?
Yep. So, all right. Well, that is the end of our session, and so we're going to go into the Q&A portion. And we do have questions in the queue. So again, thanks everybody. And Caleb, great information. Thank you so much for sharing all of that in your time today. We do have questions. If you do have questions or need further clarification, please type them into the GoToWebinar question queue. You just pull down the little question arrow and it allows you to type in questions. So first question is, do you have a better chance of winning the chargeback if you have a signature?
According to the card brands, no. They don't even look at signature anymore because it's not a requirement for them. A lot of merchants just feel more comfortable asking for the signature. But again, the issuer they don't have the cardholder signature on file, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's not something that they're actively comparing when they get a receipt. It's not like they look at the receipt and then they pull up the cardholder's profile and they're lining it. So the answer is no.
Okay. So just follow the no signature rules that are now available.
They cannot pass a chargeback to you because you didn't get a signature. That's the important thing.
Okay. Good. Any comment on handling chargebacks related to transactional data via payment applications like mobile? I mean, when you're dealing with the differences there. Any thoughts on that?
That, honestly, to me, is so new. Just getting into the mobile space makes me very, very nervous because it's not technically a point of sale that we can control, right? They're using the phone to facilitate the transaction.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure there are going to be people who are smart out there that can manipulate that transaction data to look however they want it to look to flow through. So my opinion in that is when you implement mobile, be very, very vigilant. When getting chargebacks, look at them in depth. And again, work with your POS product managers to make sure that the data coming through from the mobile transaction is closely resembling that of a either swiped or dipped transaction. If not, then you need to go back to your mobile folks and ask why it was coded that way.
Right. And dipped meaning inserted. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Is there more value in a physical handwritten signature or a digital signature?
No. Either one. I mean, again, signature is supposed, according to the card brands, if you believe them, signature has no value anymore.
How are you handling AFD foreign EMV chargebacks?
Those, unfortunately, because they are outside of the liability shift, those are ones that we're just having to go ahead and absorb.
Yeah, we did not get the 3-year extension on those,
right.
Did we?
Anything that is issued outside of the U.S. that is an AFD, we're just automatically accepting those. I would say that when you do see a transaction that is charged back for the AFD, just go out there, double check, and make sure that it truly is a foreign issued card and they're not trying to pass something through to you.
Okay. Another question is, do we think that how long, let's see here. I'm not sure I understand this question. So the person who asked this question, how long before we have a new requirement? If you could maybe clarify that a little bit more, maybe you understand.
I think you're asking how long before we have a new, something like EMV coming along. Hopefully that's correct. I would say a few years. We are going to be moving to the EMV chip plus PIN, which is something that Europe has been on for 15, 20 years. So not only would the customer have to enter in their Visa card, they would have to dip it in, insert it in, but there would also be a PIN number attached to that. So traditionally, customer has either inserted or swiped their card, and then they have signed as basically the verification method. We are going to be moving towards a customer entering in almost like a digital signature with a PIN as a verification method.
Okay.
And those would be, even though they have a PIN, those would not be considered PIN debit. So just to clarify.
Sure. Yeah, we're getting some questions in on some more information relative to some of the EMV basics and things like that. And I think there's a really great document. I'm going to plug Conexxus again here, but Conexxus in conjunction with the folks from the U.S. Payments Forum, formerly known as the EMV Migration Forum, put together a white paper for petroleum merchants, because there's so much data out there. You can go to the U.S. Payments Forum, or they're formerly called EMV Migration Forum website, and go to the resources tab, and there's a ton of white papers and documentation. But it's kind of like, how do you sort through all of that and figure out what's relative to petroleum? And so Connexus actually did a white paper, and if you go to connexus.org and go into the resources tab, there's a great white paper on EMV, some of the basics and what it means, technical, some of the things that, and it's just centric to Pentro. So I would encourage you to go to that, and even for those that know a lot about EMV, it's just a great resource for Petro. And I know that there's been some new white papers introduced, so they're in the process of starting to upgrade that. But next question is, do we think the October 1st, 2020 date will hold true?
Yes, absolutely. Issuers they want their bottom line to increase, right? So they have no desire to move this deadline. And unfortunately, issuer trumps merchant. So as long as they are pushing the card brands, I 100% believe that will stay.
Yeah, and we're hearing that. I mean, Caleb and I are both involved in not only Connexus, but other organizations where the card brands are very visible, and they've made it very, very clear that that date will not move. So hold on for the wild ride. So next question is, how do you deal with a customer charging back a duplicate charge, but funding was only received once?
In that scenario, we've been able to basically go back and pull the funding log from where we were funded one time and work with our acquirer to see what happened. Typically, it's an issue on the issuer end where, let's say that a reversal was sent up, but the issuer didn't see that and didn't apply that. So in those cases, work with your processor or your acquirer to track that transaction down. They can show that you were only funded once, and they should be able to provide additional details about any transaction that was sent to the issuer and that should have subsequently been canceled. So reach out to your issuer, or excuse me, to your acquirer or processor on those, and they should have all the details and should be able to lay that out for you.
Okay. Next question, what are the best ways to currently prevent chargebacks at the outside dispensers? So obviously before EMV, because I know that, I think most everybody's kind of testing it. A few have rolled out, but before it really gets going, what can we do these days?
AVS, if you don't have zip code enabled, you're behind the 8 ball. Even though if the card is counterfeit, they have the ability to get the zip code. It's at least the starting point. Host to velocity. Make sure that you've got kind of common sense rules to where a customer isn't able to just either test the card over and over or use it over and over. We want to limit our liability there as far as how many times they can swipe the card. Make sure your shutoff limits make sense for your business. Don't have $500 shutoff limits on your gas pump that allow somebody to rack up charges. And I will plug VTA, Visa Transaction Advisory, because it's been extremely helpful for us in high fraud markets in getting our sites off of naughty list. So talk to your brand, talk to your Visa rep. These are basically host-based tools. Other than having someone out there at the pump and asking to see every customer's card, which is not feasible.
Right, unless you're full service everywhere, right? Yeah. So, thank you. Is there a common amount used by merchants where any amount under it they accept and move on, like for the chargeback?
It depends. A lot of merchants that I've talked to have like a $25 limit. If it's under $25, they accept it and they move on. Here we look at more of the reason codes and the amounts because that makes more sense for us. We know certain reason codes, what documentation works and that we can win. So even if it's a $2 transaction for a processing error where the date and time was wrong, We know that, hey, I've got a host log here that provides the host date and time.
Gotcha.
I'll
Yep.
submit that. So look at your reason codes, not so much the amount.
Okay. Do we, the next question is what is the average transaction chargeback amount? So, and I think it varies. It's kind of like our average ticket, right?
Right.
It's going to vary on the price on the street, the price per gallon of fuel.
It does, and it also varies by reason. For example, your fraud, lost, and stolen averages about $75 because they're filling up multiple cars on their buddies behind them. EMV counterfeit is $99.89 because they know that at $100 they get a whole nother Visa score.
Okay.
Inside, it depends. There's not an average.
Yeah.
We've seen chargebacks for a penny. We've seen chargebacks for $9,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Rhyme or reason.
Yeah. So for EMV transactions, is the receipt still required, or can the details that the IT department can pull accepted for the same?
Yes, you can pull that off of your back office as long as it shows the transactional information, the card, the approval code, the EMV information. Yes, you can 100% pull that off of your back office.
So then you don't need the receipt.
Right.
For those
A lot of people have stopped receipts. Customers don't want them. They don't want to have to keep up with them. As long as you can access it through your your electronic journal, that's fine. That's totally acceptable.
Great. So you said that if the merchant reaches or exceeds the chargeback threshold, the merchant loses the indemnification.
Correct.
Okay. So does that mean that the merchant assumes the liability?
Yes. So those would start to be passed through, and they have a special reason code. Basically, it's you've exceeded our fraud program. This is your responsibility from now on. Each of the card brands give you a period to remediate out of, but during that remediation period, those chargebacks still may be passed on to you. So just something to keep in mind.
And the excessive chargebacks, sometimes they are immediate.
Yes.
Yep, and sometimes, yeah. Okay. When it comes to holds from the cards being used at the pumps, who's responsible for releasing the holds?
That is the issuer. That is 100% the issuer.
So why do they keep saying it's the merchant?
Because that is all they can see. So when you call into your issuer, they don't see basically the backside of the transaction. They see pending hold amount. They don't see when that's going to clear because you're just talking to a customer service rep. We get this call most often with debit. So with PIN debit, you swipe your card at the pump, you enter in your PIN, whatever. We as merchants have 45 minutes to send that clearing message to that debit network.
Yeah.
Now, the debit network then contracts with each individual bank on how quickly they get the message. So at that point, when we sent that message to the debit network within that 45 minutes, we've lost sight of it.
So what do you do? And I think this is kind of where they're headed is you know, the customer calls you, it's a Friday, you know, you get the sad story that and it's also with prepaid gift cards, right? And prepaid gift cards are not great because a lot of them have 30-day holds.
Oh, prepaid gift cards are the worst.
Yeah. But anyway, but for like a debit card hold, I mean, sometimes what I would do in the past, I don't know if you can still do it today, is I would do a three-way call with the customer.
Yeah.
Because the customer would be so mad at us being the merchant holding quote unquote our funds. And so then we'd call the bank together, call the customer service number on the back of their card, and then the bank would release it, and then the customer would typically apologize for being so rude, right?
Oh, I mean, there's been, countless times that our settlement team has been on the phone with the debit network, with the customer's bank, and finally we get someone in auth and settlement or auth and clearing that can see the transaction and can go ahead and force post it. But I mean, as a merchant, it's our name that's out there, so we're the ones that it does appear we're the problem. You just got to keep calling people and be a nuisance until you get someone who actually knows where to look.
Right. Okay. So can you clarify the AFD chargebacks? So under what circumstances should a retailer pay for those AFDs, or automated fuel dispenser chargebacks?
So right now, the only ones that are being passed through to us are lost and stolen, and then customer disputes and processing errors. So if a few examples of ones that we see pretty commonly is customer will dispute the quality of fuel. They'll say that the fuel they got broke their car. I mean, those are hard to dispute, or they'll say they didn't pump this much. In that case, you kind of just have to make a subdraft and submit a letter and hope for the best.
Yeah. So, all right. So if there's any other questions, Caleb, is there a best way for them to reach you? They can go through they can contact info@conexxus.org.
Yes.
And then Conexxus can get to Caleb. So, and I think those were all of the questions for today. So again, everybody, we want to thank you. Again, that email is info@conexxus.org, and you can visit us on the website. And again, there's some great resources, even if you're not a member of Conexxus, under the resources tab. And of course, follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. So thanks, everybody. We appreciate you attending today, and have a great holiday season.